Hey guys, how's it going? I am here to talk about The Metamorphoses by Ovid. So this was a part of a buddy read with Elena Macredina, and basically we just did the read-along Shake Tube style. We both read the book and then just post our reaction video. Yeah, I'm gonna keep this video hopefully pretty casual, just not getting too in-depth or analytical, just giving my impressions and thoughts on this book. This is my second time reading it. I read it last year. Last year I read it in the Rolfe Humphreys translation. This is the Horace Gregory translation, which also has a really nice afterword, and is a really highly regarded translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. I originally was just going to reread the Rolfe Humphreys translation, but I happened to be in a bookstore, and this was quite cheap, so I just grabbed it. So yeah, Ovid's Metamorphoses. Ovid was a Roman poet. This was published back in 8 AD, back in the good old days. Ovid sounds like he lived a pretty interesting life. Horace Gregory talks a little bit about him in his afterword, and the Metamorphoses may have actually been one thing that contributed to Ovid's being banished from Rome. So at one point, the Emperor Augustus banished him from Rome for a reason that remains unknown now. Ostensibly, he knew some secret about the emperor that he wasn't supposed to, and that's why he was banished. But Horace Gregory seems to suggest that works like the Metamorphoses, as well as others of Ovid's poetry, may have disinclined Augustus to be merciful to Ovid, because Augustus saw them as promoting immorality and licentiousness. But anyway, this is just a little bit of background on Ovid. He completed the Metamorphoses, I believe, before he was banished, and then wrote one other work while he was banished, which I haven't read. But so anyway, this book is basically a long epic poem. It's a collection of Greek and Roman myths. It starts with a creation story by a god who is not Zeus and is not any other god. He's just God, apparently. And it ends with the deification of Julius Caesar. It's not linear, though, in really. You know, it doesn't go from one era of history which transitions to another era or anything. Basically, Ovid just wanted to write about the stories that he wanted to write about. You know, he draws on a lot of old myths and takes artistic license, as Horace Gregory points out, to make them more entertaining. There is always a sort of running thread between each story, so it's often quite loose, but there will usually be some transition. It won't just be that he'll abruptly switch from one story to the next story. There will be some linking thread, but often it's kind of weak. Although, that being said, there is kind of a progression forward in time, as you can see, or through history, toward the founding of Rome and the rise of Caesar, because you kind of start to get stories about the creation, for example, building of the Trojan Wall, the Wall of Troy, which is one of the legends he talks about, and Troy. Then you have the Trojan War later on, much later in the book, and then you have the story of Aeneas, who flees Troy after it falls, and then Aeneas founds Rome, and then there are stories after that as well. So that does start to crop up and starts to turn it into a bit more of a linear story. But I don't think Ovid was particularly interested in, like, history, even a mythological history here. He just, I think, wanted to write some good stories, basically. So yeah, this poem was hugely influential on literature, and that's easy to see if you've read any Shakespeare. You know, you read the story of Pyramus and Thisbe in Ovid's Metamorphoses, and you see Romeo and Juliet. Pyramus and Thisbe were two a young boy and a young girl in some town in Rome, or in Greece, whose parents didn't want them to be together, but they were in love. So they one day decide to run off together. They are able to communicate by a crack in the wall between their two parents' houses, so the houses are right next to each other, and they're able to communicate through that crack, so they agree that they're going to run away together. And Thisbe, I believe is the girl, runs away first out into the woods to a place near a tree, and is assaulted by a lion. She escapes from the lion into a cave, so she doesn't die. but the lion is able to grab onto her outer garment of some sort, her dress or something, and it gets kind of bloody, I guess. And then later on, of course, you can probably see where this is going. Pyramus comes along, sees the dress in the lion's mouth, and thinks that Thisbe is dead, and so he stabs himself, and then Thisbe comes walking out and of course finds him dying, and then stabs herself, and then, like in most of the stories in this collection, they are then transformed into, I can't remember what they're actually transformed into, but most of the stories in this collection end with the main characters being transformed or metamorphosed, if you will, into something. And so some of these stories are sort of origin stories of different natural phenomena. So like you have the story of Narcissus, who when he saw his reflection fell in love with himself, where we get the word narcissist, and eventually he just kind of wasted away staring at his own reflection, and then turned into the flower, the Narcissus. So anyway, yeah, that's just a long-winded primer on what this book is kind of like. Aside from that, I view it as just kind of almost a collection of short stories, I suppose you could see it, that sort of interconnected short stories. And so I just want to talk about now some of the stories in it that I liked the most and that had the biggest impact on me. The first one, the one that stuck with me the most, along with one other, is the story of Niobe, who is a queen who doesn't want to give homage to the goddess Latona. So Latona is the goddess who is the mother of Apollo and Diana. So in Niobe's kingdom, you're supposed to give homage to Latona because she's a goddess. But Niobe is kind of cocky, and because she has 7 sons and 7 daughters, whereas Latona only has the 1 son and the 1 daughter. And so she kind of says, well, why should I have to pay homage to this woman who doesn't even have as many children as I do, doesn't even have half as many children as I do. And so she spurns giving Latona offerings at the temple, and this kind of pisses Latona off. And so Latona, as you do, has Apollo and Diana kill Niobe's 7 sons and 7 daughters. And then basically Niobe is left with nothing, and kind of just spends her time crying, and eventually is transformed into a statue. So anyway, I just found that story very moving, and, you know, Niobe, like, Latona and Niobe show the same kind of pride, in a sense. Latona shows her pride because she's a goddess who wants offerings, and who has a son and a daughter that she's cocky about, and, I mean, they're both gods, so go figure. And then Niobe is cocky because she has 7 sons, 7 daughters. And so they both show that kind of pride. I mean, I guess I'd say neither of them is in the right or the wrong, but it just happens that Latona is a goddess and has a son and a daughter who are both gods, and so she is the one who wins out. And that's kind of a theme of the next story I want to talk about, which is the story of Arachne and Athena. So Athena, goddess of wisdom, as you all know, and Arachne is this woman who's a legendary weaver. And again, like with Niobe, she kind of is very cocky about this, very boastful and prideful, talking about how she's the greatest weaver, you know, in the world. And of course, Athena is a weaver. And so she's not very happy that Arachne is going around saying that she's the greatest weaver in the world. So Athena challenges Arachne to a weaving contest where they will both weave a tapestry, and whoever weaves the best wins. And Athena, this is a very interesting part, Athena weaves this tapestry kind of demonstrating all the glories of the gods, you know, just everything, all the wonderful things the gods have done, and all the things that they do, and everything. And just showing them in all of their splendor. And Arachne, though, kind of weaves a tapestry about the way that mortals often suffer at the whims of the gods. And that's funny, because it's kind of an almost meta moment in the story, because in Ovid's Metamorphoses, mortals often do suffer at the whims of gods and goddesses for no real fault of their own. And so it's interesting to have that sort of commentary on the story itself within the story, in the form of this tapestry that Arachne weaves. And it actually turns out that Arachne's tapestry is judged as better than Athena's, and Athena isn't very happy with that either, so as one does, she has her turned into a spider, which is kind of, I guess, probably where we get Arachnid. Yeah, anyway, moving on. Now we move into the section where a few stories that kind of struck me, just kind of their weirdness by today's standards, and weirdness because they were written in, ancient Rome. We have the story of Cinyras and Myrrha. So Myrrha is a young girl, Cinyras is her father, and Myrrha sort of inexplicably falls madly in love with her father, and is just so eaten up by this. She's so torn up by the fact that he's her father, so that's incestuous, but also the desire to be with him as a lover and not just as a daughter. And so Myrrha's nurse actually schemes with Myrrha to allow her to have sex with her father. So there's this festival festival in this land where this is taking place, where for I think 7 days, the married men are not supposed to have sex with their wives. So the nurse and Myrrha kind of figure that her father in that 7 days will be kind of feeling lusty, I suppose. And so basically what the nurse does is she makes sure that Cinyras gets very drunk and then sneaks Myrrha into his room, or maybe she doesn't sneak him into his room, but well, no, she does, because, she sneaks Myrrha into her room, and, so basically for 7 days, Cinyras and Myrrha do have sex, and apparently Cinyras just doesn't look at Myrrha's face for those 7 days, or when she's in his bed those 7 days, because on the 7th day, all of a sudden a light comes on, somehow, and he realizes that it's his daughter, and is just horrified that he's been having sex with his daughter, and so she's also kind of horrified with what she's done. She runs away. She's pregnant, of course, and then she is transformed into a tree, and her baby is kind of rescued from the now tree, and that baby is Adonis, who Venus, the goddess of love, famously has an affair with, which is I know Shakespeare has a poem about Venus and Adonis, and I believe Edmund Spenser wrote a poem about Venus and Adonis. So there's that story. I'm not going to go into that, but the nurse in Cinyras and Myrrha's story, going back to the influences it's had, the Horace Gregory kind of points out in his introduction to that book, to that section, that the nurse is kind of reminiscent of Juliet's nurse from Romeo and Juliet. So you not only have the story of Pyramus and Thisbe, but you have possibly a predictor of Juliet's nurse. And then moving on, the story of Procne and Philomela was an interesting story for a couple of reasons. So Procne is married to the king of Thrace, or maybe not the king of Thrace, but a man who lives in Thrace. And Philomela is her sister, and Philomela lives in Athens, where Procne is from. And Procne just kind of, on a whim, says she wants to see her sister. And her husband, she has her husband go to Athens to ask her and Philomela's father if he will let Philomela visit them. And the husband just, out of the blue, falls in love with Philomela, with his wife's sister, and just totally lusts after her. And so he gets her father to let her come visit, and as any man who wants to have an affair does, he decides to lock her in a cabin, rape her, and cut off her tongue, and then tell her sister that she's dead. What happens, basically how this is resolved, is Philomela gets her hands on some weaving equipment, I guess weaving is sort of a running sort of theme in this book. It pops up a few times. Philomena weaves into a tapestry what's happened to her, and has a servant, because apparently she has servants, bring it to her sister Procne, and Procne sees the tapestry, knows what's happened, goes, retrieves her sister, and then the story just takes a totally gruesome turn. So Procne and her husband have a son, and so to get revenge on her husband for doing this to her sister, she takes her own son, kills him, bakes him into a pie, and then feeds the pie to her husband. So, yeah, and then I think they're all transformed into birds at the end, all three of them, yeah. So the husband, Procne reveals to her husband that that she's baked their son into this pie as he's eating it, and then he obviously gets quite angry and goes in to attack her, but at that point they're all changed into birds. So that's just a strange story. A mother attacking her own son is just I don't know what to make of that. I think based on what Horace Gregory had to say in his afterword about this, and kind of the views on women, the way we might view it is that it was, the passion of a woman who just couldn't control herself, essentially. That might not be what Ovid meant, but that's how I'm thinking he might have meant it. I don't know. I don't subscribe to that view of women, but many in ancient Rome did. So yeah, again, the theme of sort of forbidden sexual desire, I suppose, and sexual desire completely run to a dark place. Yeah. So anyway, next story is that I want to talk about is one story that I was surprised by. I think I may have vaguely recalled it from my first reading of Ovid's Metamorphoses, but not very much, because it must be one of the first instances in literature ever of both lesbian love between two women, or at least love of one woman for another woman. The other woman might not reciprocate. And one of the first instances in literature of a transgender person. So this is the story of Iphis and Ianthe. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this correctly, but Iphis's father, like every good father, wants a son, and tells his wife that if their child is born and it's born as a daughter, then they should just let it die. Again, as you do. So the mother doesn't like that idea, and of course her baby is born as a girl, and so the mother hides the baby's sex and raises her as a boy. And then, naturally, the girl who is disguised as a boy, Iphis, is raised and eventually is supposed to marry. And that sort of presents a bit of an issue. But Ianthe is one of the suitors for Iphis, and Iphis just falls madly in love with Ianthe. And so Iphis and her mother are just not sure what to do about this, because obviously Ianthe is going to find out that she's not a woman, or is not a man. So I believe a god comes and transforms Iphis into a man. And so then he now can marry the love of his life. So yeah, just a lot of these stories of sexual desire that is either deviant or would have been perceived as deviant. And yeah, I think that it's sort of a way for Ovid to deal with sexual desire in a sort of bombastic way, like probably none of us are ever going to be in love with our father or be in love with our sister or our brother. Sorry, Dr. Freud, the Oedipus complex is not a thing. But I think that these are just ways of exploring the way that people react when they have a strong sexual desire, whether it's deviant or not, in a sense. I don't like calling lesbian love deviant, of course, because it's not deviant, So, yeah, and because all of these characters in these situations, while they're in, fantastical situations, of course, they respond like people would. Not always intelligently, of course, but they do respond in a way that you could believe often, I think. And I think that that's one of the most important things to take away from Ovid. It's just that he's an incredible human psychologist. Actually, Horace Gregory, I think, articulates this much better than I can. So I'm just going to read a very little bit from his afterword. Here we go. At his best, no writer of this golden age in Roman literature has excelled him in the rapid unfolding of a narrative, nor has any surpassed him in the direct revelations of psychological detail. However far-fetched, melodramatic, or strained a few of his situations may seem to the 20th century reader, they never fail to create the illusion of life, in its mystery and irony, in its splendor or cruelty, in its affectionate humors and warmth of feeling, in its celebration of earthly beauty. So yeah, anyway, I definitely agree with Horace Gregory on that score. And that kind of takes me to my final story. This is very brief, I promise. I'm almost done. I can't keep track of how long this is going. I'm sure it's ungodly long, so I'm sorry. If you're still watching, thank you. The final story, and the story that I think I find most moving, and I find it moving wherever I read about it. I read about it in Edith Hamilton's mythology. But it's the story of Hecuba. And Hecuba is the wife of Priam, who is the king of Troy. And so you can imagine when Troy falls, she loses everything. Her husband is dead, her son Hector is dead, her grandson is dead. And her home, of course, is burned to the ground. And at the last minute, she has one daughter left alive, and she's just hoping she can hold on to her daughter and hold on to at least one thing, and then her daughter is killed. And that's just one of the most heartbreaking parts of this entire book. This can also be a very moving story at other times. Yeah, anyway, I just wanted to mention that because it's probably the image that sticks the most with me. And it's around that point in the poem where I would like to just read a short excerpt from the poem itself, from this translation. Just to give you a little taste of this translation, because it is quite a good translation. Or at least, I can't speak to how good a translation it is from the Latin, but it's a very great work in English, I think. So anyway, this is just after Hecuba has lost everything, and it's sort of the narrative shifts to another sort of side story. So the goddess Aurora, who is the goddess of the dawn, had supported Troy mostly, but her son Memnon is dying, and Zeus just asks that he honor her son in some way upon his death, because he died bravely fighting for Priam. And I just love the beauty of this passage. The smoke of Memnon's pyre shot up to heaven, turning day to night, as when a mist that floats above a river grows to a cloud that shuts away the sun. Black ashes rose from earth like fluttering wings that seemed to join, and form the flames beneath them. They gathered strength and seemed to come to life. They flew like birds, then turned to birds in flight. Bird cry and noise of wings through darkening air. Sisters and brothers circling round the pyre. 3 times they came to vanish in the sky. Then a 4th time in clouds with noise of battle. The fiery ravens split their ranks in 2, and in 2 racing armies fought, beak claw in cutting fury, tearing at each heart, and as they fell, they were memorial of Memnon's ashes, which they had given them birth. For his sake they were named Memnonides, and even now, when the eternal sun runs through 12 blazing cycles of the heavens, they meet to fight, to die, to fall again, in memory of him who gave them being. So yeah, I just thought that was a beautiful passage, and I just wanted to read that to give a little taste of this translation. So yeah, anyway, this is an ungodly long video. It's probably going to be one of the longest videos I've ever posted. But the book kind of ends with, I'm gonna try to cut short my discussion of this last part, but the final section of Ovid's Metamorphoses has this kind of long philosophical poem that kind of just discusses a lot of the themes of the Metamorphoses, you know, the theme of change, which is the primary theme of the Metamorphoses, and how everything in the world is transient, nothing stays the same for long, everyone dies all too quickly, but is also kind of reborn in a sense, even if it's just through, you know, dissolving into the earth and nourishing plants or and other animals. And I found that last poem just beautiful as well. And one of the most striking images that I just loved was this image of a man who's just been buried, and obviously a dead man who's just been buried, and his spine transforms into a snake. I just thought that that was such a beautiful and brilliant encapsulation of this theme of change and transience, and how death ends up creating more life. So yeah, anyway, that is Ovid's Metamorphoses. If any of you are even still watching now, then thank you for making it to the end. I hope this made sense. And yeah, anyway, I really enjoyed this book, and yeah, if anyone's read Ovid's Metamorphoses, please do give me your thoughts. I would love to discuss this in the comments. So, yeah, anyway, thanks for watching, everyone. Bye!